Socialism, nationalism, social nationalism, national socialism. What are we talking about? What's this series going to be about? There's this thing in the world that either existed at one point and doesn't exist anymore, or it still exists now. I don't even think we've decided really whether it still exists or not. It's called fascism. You've probably heard of it. You might know something about it. I know a lot about it, trust me. Essentially, this video is going to be a series about the history and prehistory and maybe post-history of fascism. But it isn't called a history of fascism. It's called National Socialism and Intimate History. And there's a reason for that. The word fascism is a little bit confusing, although not quite maybe as confusing as you might think at first once you learn a little bit more about it. But I guess the one thing that is a little confusing about it is that it both demands specificity and refuses to adhere to it. But what I have discovered is that fascism, if it is anything we can characterize specifically, then it exists within a broader selection of ideas and phenomena that were born out of both the radical left and the radical right of politics during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So when I use the term National Socialism in this series, I am not talking about a specific ideology or a specific movement. It's not specific. And in fact, that's why I use the term, because I feel that fascism is a little bit too specific. When I use the term, I use it to refer to a very broad section of political theory and political action that existed roughly between the years 1885 and 1945. That is what I would consider the core epoch of this National Socialist phenomenon, a period of roughly 60 years. There, of course, might be a little bit of confusion because the way the term is normally used in literature is to refer to the ideology promoted and utilized by the National Socialist German Workers' Party, a specific political party in Germany at a specific time. However, if you dig into the literature more, and especially into primary sources, you'll find that while the term National Socialism, like put together in that specific way, isn't used all that often, the terms nationalism and socialism and the concepts of combining nationalism and socialism, the concept of having a national socialism or a social nationalism in whatever sort, they appear over and over and over and over and over in this study. And so to me, this is the most obvious term to use to describe this whole phenomenon, this whole non-specific phenomenon. But despite its non-specificity, I would say that it is qualitatively observable. I think we can learn more from the National Socialist epoch than from any other era in our history. I think it's one of the most thought-provoking things I've ever read about, probably the most. And one thing about it that makes it interesting is that it represents a sort of convergence of all the strains of Enlightenment thought with a reaction against those strains of thought, like Enlightenment thought sort of progressing to the point where it starts turning against itself, where the skepticism of the Enlightenment turns against skepticism itself. It's a strange and very modernist, not postmodern, but modern, like the kind of deconstruction that happened before postmodernism. It's a deconstructive Ouroboros of philosophy. Benito Mussolini talked about being able to recognize the synthesis of antitheses. And of course, he was referring to class and nation as they're often understood, creating a national socialism. But I think the synthesis of opposites is such a crucial and interesting aspect of this. And that's one of the reasons it fascinates me so much. But the results of this convergence were very, very extreme, and they had some very pointed effects on the people who lived during this time. And in fact, the kind of death of the movement, as I understand it in 1945, was not a slow petering out of influence. It was a catastrophic calamity. It was a brutal annihilation and climax, which, thematically, I guess, is kind of appropriate for this movement. It does sort of poetically resonate with a lot of the themes of this movement. But this convergence produced ideas, and people acted on these ideas, and these actions had consequences, for better or for worse. I think this is why it's actually kind of controversial to even talk about the National Socialist epoch. But with that said, I would like to preserve a lot of the human context in this story. I would like to understand, and part of that is I would like to understand the actors and their actions. Hence why I want this to be a more intimate approach. I want us to be able to get to know the characters in this story the way you would be able to get to know characters in an epic novel or a movie. I want it to kind of have a sprawling saga-like narrative structure with lots of interconnecting pieces and players. Because I think only when diving really deep into the details of it like that can you really appreciate the story. I think all too often history tends to kind of depersonalize things, especially like a visual medium history like this, like a documentary or a YouTube video, tends to depersonalize narrative. We go over broad strokes and you end up with this kind of grand narrative that doesn't actually give you much of an understanding of anything. You lose a lot of important context and it oversimplifies things. I want this series to be more like a book, more like the thoroughness that you get out of a book. Grand narratives tend to smooth out all the details, but when you read an actual book, you often see that, oh, these are actually really varied, complex, interesting people. They often agreed with each other. They often disagreed with each other. They had their own motivations. They had their own lives going on. They often got along together despite their differences. They often fought against each other despite their similarities. I want to explore all of that. So in other words, this will not be an overview. I intend this to be a long, continuous project on this channel with many episodes. I want it to be like a thing where you can keep coming back, seeing more of the story, filling in more of the details. You're not gonna binge this all in one go. And we're not gonna stop at 1945 because, of course, the people involved in the events of 45 lived often well after that. I want to explore their whole lives, not just the part where history finds them relevant. And of course, the consequences of their thought and action carry on in interesting ways that could also be interesting to explore. And likewise, we're not going to just start at 1885 roughly. We have to explain how things got the way they are in 1885. I can't just plunge you right in at the beginning of the story. However, since the core epoch of the 1880s to the 1940s is our time frame, the stuff covering, the prehistory of all of that up to the 1880s will be a little bit more conventional in approach. It'll be more of an overview. I have 3 episodes planned for just the introductory segment. 3 episodes is kind of a lot, but my style, I'm not into brevity. And I want you to actually be able to kind of get a feel for the 19th century, to get a feel for how this stuff actually how the memory of this stuff felt for the people at the time. So that by the time we get into the characters who we're really going to explore, we know what their zeitgeist is going in. I don't like the idea of just dropping you into a thing without preparation, but we're not necessarily going to get to know the pre-1880s characters the way we will get to know the later ones. We'll get to know them a bit, enough that we get the gist. So with that in mind, I would like to invite you to just, open up your mind a little bit, indulge me a little bit in my own storytelling style so that I can take you back into the ancient past to figure out how all this got the way it became. I guess I'm dividing it into books and chapters. I like the idea of having a bit of a broad skeleton. So book 1 of this series I'm calling The New Romans. And in it, we're going to be focusing mainly on characters of French and Italian nationality. And so that's the history that we're going to cover first. How France and Italy got to where they are, how the zeitgeists of those two nations became what they were in the late 19th century, and a little bit about how nationalism and socialism came about. There are several languages in the world, Spanish being the biggest of them, but of course there's also Portuguese, French, Italian, Romanian, to name the big ones, that all have something in common, which is that they are all evolved versions of the core language, Latin. The original speakers of Latin were called Latins, or they are called Latins today, and they lived in an area of west central Italy, which today is known as Lazio. Back then, it was called Latium. Latin is an Italic language, and now the only Italic languages left are those Latin languages. But it used to just be one of many Italic languages, including, various Oscan and Umbrian languages. Those made up the East Italic family. And then Latin had a close relative called Faliscan, which is spoken in a similar area in that Lazio region. This was roughly the mid-first millennium BC. In the very north of Italy, you had people who spoke Celtic languages, which are very closely related to Italic languages, although they are considered a different subset. And in the south, especially along the coastlines and in the island of Sicily, you had a lot of people who spoke Greek, because there were a lot of Greek immigrant communities in southern Italy and Sicily at this time and a little bit later. But these are not like our understanding of an immigrant as someone from a less fortunate area that moves into a more prosperous country for opportunities. This would be more like our idea of a colonist. They set up their own city-states in the area, they controlled their own politics and their own culture, and the Latins and other Italians learned a lot from them, culturally speaking, because of their presence in Italy, including the Etruscans, or Tuscans, who lived in Etruria, or Tuscany, to the north of Lazio, who, by the way, did not speak an Italic language, and nobody is really sure what language they did speak. There's a story there. But there wasn't any hegemonic state in control of Italy at that time. It was pretty much every city was out for itself. There was one city-state in Lazio called Roma, which developed the most capable civic and military apparatus, and soon enough that it actually did become that hegemonic power. It conquered all of Italy, including the Greek city-states, and all of Sicily, and then eventually all of Greece itself. In English, of course, Roma is called Rome, and we all have some idea of what ancient Rome is, even if we don't know much about it. Rome was, of course, an aristocratic republic. And the term aristocratic and the term republic, they might be a little bit contradictory with each other, because an aristocracy is a power structure where the certain very old, very wealthy families have legal privilege over the rest. Although in practice, a republic really is just any sovereignty that's not ruled by a traditional sovereign like a king. And so there was always this tension in the Roman Republic. And you see that going back to the very first days of the Republic, even literally the first year of the Republic. You have this tension, this palpable tension between the aristocracy, which in the Roman system were called patricians, and the rest of the people, who were called plebeians. Plebeians were anyone who wasn't part of Rome's 10 original founding families. But then there was another type of plebeian, a more specific type, called proletarii. You might notice that the word is somewhat similar to the English word proliferate. That's because proletarii, or proletariat we could call them, were basically anybody who didn't own land. People who had to rent or work in servitude for someone else. They had a lot of children and they proliferated their population that way. But other than simply providing children for the Republic, they weren't viewed as contributing anything really meaningful to the system. It kind of reminds me of that song that goes, "Been around the world and found that only stupid people are breeding, the Cretans cloning and feeding." That's kind of how the Roman government viewed the proletariat. They were only slightly more privileged than slaves, and well, actually, sometimes slaves actually had better lives. So in the Republic period, you had two political parties. These are not, formal political parties as we understand them in the modern way. These are just alignments. One of the parties was called the Optimates, and they were basically conservatives. My favorite example of an Optimate is from the really early Republic days, named Appius Claudius Sabinus. And they were conservative because they wanted to preserve the aristocracy's control over the country. Then the other group were called the Populares. We could call them populists, like Tiberius Gracchus, for instance, is probably the most famous example of a Roman populist. The populists thought that to solve the tensions in the country, they actually had to listen to the will of the plebeians and even sometimes the proletarians. And sometimes this was actually seen as a very dire and important thing to prevent the actual collapse of the system altogether under the pressure of these people, these riotous people. As part of this idea, there was this concept that was floating around at the time. I don't think it ever got a proper codified term, but you see it in the writings of the historian Dionysius. It was that a commonwealth or a republic is sort of like a human body. And the word for body in Latin was corpus. And so the idea is that an occupation or a social role or a class in Roman society is like a human body part. And so all of the different parts of the body have to work together with each other in order to maintain the overall health of the system. If one of the body parts decides not to cooperate, then that isn't just sabotage for all the other body parts, it is also suicide. Italy, during the first millennium BC, was a very rough, very tough place. You had to be tough to survive. And if you were part of a commonwealth, that commonwealth had to be very disciplined in order to survive the pressures and competition with all of the other commonwealths. In that way, if things are running well, then every aspect of society is incorporated. The word incorporate comes from that very same word, corpus. And so in that sense, a commonwealth could be thought of as a corporation. Obviously, we're using the term corporation a little bit differently from how it's used in the capitalist economic system that we're used to. But what's important about this is that the use of the term corporation in this way will appear a lot, to refer to a commonwealth, will appear a lot in the National Socialist epoch. And this understanding of the commonwealth as a corpus or corporation goes all the way back to Roman times with Dionysius. And so the Optimates, like Appius Claudius Sabinus, thought that the best way to maintain the overall health of this incorporated republic was to come down really hard on the people on the bottom and force them with the intimidation of the power of the state into submission. Appius thought that only fear could produce discipline. And if you just give everyone what they want, then they won't want to work for it. They will expect it. And so the Commonwealth will weaken as a result of motivation decreasing, and then it will fall prey to the other Latin and Etruscan wolves in the surrounding country threatening to eat them. Appius also thought that the poor were not really the people society needed to be worried about. They were not the most dangerous people. It was the rich who were the most dangerous, who had the most at stake and had the best ability to defend it. And this gets to an idea that goes back to the Servian reforms under the monarchy period, before Rome was a republic. Under the Roman system, soldiers were expected to pay for their own equipment, like weapons and armor and horses. And so the wealthiest Romans were the ones who were most kitted out. And so they were the ones who were used the most in battle, and thus they became the best soldiers, the most experienced soldiers. The poor people who could maybe only afford a rock and a sling, they were used more as reserve troops. And so the theory went that because the wealthy were the better trained soldiers. They were the most experienced soldiers. They were the ones with the best equipment. They also had the most at stake because they had the land that needed to be defended, and war was really a matter of property. It was a very harsh world, and you were expected to defend your own interests. You were expected to defend your own property. Nobody was going to do it for you. And so the purpose of the Commonwealth at that time, really early on, was to sort of act as a way for proprietors to defend their property collectively. The people who had the most at stake, had the biggest role in defending that stake, and therefore logically had the most political power in the country. And this is how the centuriate assembly system worked. It was a hierarchical, kind of plutocratic system, democratic, but also plutocratic, determined on a hierarchy of wealth and property. And you can imagine that as Rome's civic and military apparatus expanded and became like a very large hegemony over this whole Italian peninsula and beyond, they encountered a lot of problems with how to expand this apparatus that started out as something really developed for just one city. One of the big obstacles for them in this period of expansion was Carthage, which was a country, another republic located in North Africa, very close to Sicily. In fact, the Romans conquered Sicily because of their first war with Carthage. Carthage was a city founded by Middle Eastern Semitic merchants, Canaanites, Phoenicians, people basically who spoke languages similar to Hebrew, Arabic, Akkadian, stuff like that. Before the Greeks really started expanding their commerce during this kind of mid-first millennium BC, actually the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, beat them to that. And Carthage became really the first major country in the western part of the Mediterranean, the first major hegemonic power. But as Rome expanded, their interests clashed a lot with the Romans. But eventually Carthage became known to the Romans as this kind of great enemy of their republic, this kind of mythic arch enemy, to the point where after their third war with Carthage, they just destroyed the whole city, supposedly. Which they didn't do that. They were actually kind of famous for not doing that sort of thing. So they were really making a statement with Carthage. But because of that, you often see Carthage reappear in literary ways later on as sort of mythic framing device for a great enemy of civilization, an enemy that exists beyond the pale. The name Hannibal rhymes with cannibal, is associated with that great enemy. Also, the Hebrews wrote about Canaanites passing their children through fire in a ceremony called Moloch. This conjures up the image that the Carthaginians were practicing ritual human sacrifice of children, which added to this kind of legendary inimical quality of this alien race, associated also with the Greek and Roman term barbarian. The term barbarian originally referred to peoples who didn't speak Greek, which at first included the Romans, but then the Romans conquered the Greeks, and then Dionysius, the Greek historian who loves the Romans, had to kind of reconcile the Romans with Greek civilization and write a whole book about how the Romans are Greeks, they're not barbarians, even though they didn't speak Greek. That's a whole other story. But in the 1st century BC, the Roman general Julius Caesar conquered the region northwest of Italy, across the Alps, a region called Gaul, a barbarian region. These people didn't speak even Italic languages. They spoke Celtic languages, similar to the people of northern Italy, which was called Cisalpine Gaul, Gaul this side of the Alps. Gaul is the English term. In Latin, it was called Gallia, and the adjective Gallic comes from that. This term, Gaul or Gallic, appears in various places applied to people who spoke Celtic languages, including the Galatians of Anatolia and also the Welsh. The word Wales is an English variant of that same word that became Gallia in Latin. It's also the wall part of Cornwall. But Julius Caesar conquering Gaul is very important because now it means for the first time in history, these two regions on either side of the Alps, bordered by the river Rhine in the east, are united. Gallia and Italia are united under one single political apparatus. And then over time, the Italic culture, which is very influenced by the Greeks, migrates over into Gaul and forms a kind of Gallo-Roman synthesis. And with that, the population of Gaul gradually shift over from speaking Celtic languages to speaking the language of administration, which is Latin. Gaul, kind of similar to Italy, was a pretty pastoral region. A lot of farming happened there. But on the other side of the River Rhine in the east, you have an area that was a little bit more forested. The Romans called it Germania, and in English it's called Germany. And it was a region where people there didn't speak Italic or Celtic languages generally. They mostly spoke a different language branch, which we would call the Germanic languages. But this general, Julius Caesar, had a lot of political enemies in the city of Rome. And so rather than letting them get the better of him, he took his army across the river Rubicon, which led back into Italy. And that was illegal at the time. Now, I don't think we even know where the river Rubicon was. I think we've kind of lost the location of that. But that was the original border of Italy. But yeah, it was very illegal to do that, and he did it anyway. And that meant that once he got to Rome with his army, he just took over the city and just became the ruler of the city for a while, until he was assassinated by a group of patricians. They were, of course, trying to restore the aristocratic Republic of Rome, but that isn't actually what happened, because what happened instead is that Caesar's allies, including his nephew, his adopted nephew, Julius Caesar Octavianus, then fought a war against his enemies. Octavian and his allies won, and Octavian became the next Julius Caesar Augustus Caesar. This marked a brand new era for the Roman state, where Augustus would be given the title first citizen, in Latin princeps. Now, according to the sources, even before the Republic period, when Rome was considered a monarchy, it was not a hereditary monarchy. It was still, the kings were elected by the Senate, the congregation of old aristocrats. But following the establishment of Augustus as prince, or princeps, you have a new system that develops that's really, we're getting away entirely from the idea of a republic. And it's a hereditary system. It does get passed down the familial line, which in a way means that if we believe the sources, Rome in this era is actually more like a hereditary monarchy than they even were when they were considered a kingdom. But rather than the term princeps, which of course lives on in the word prince, you get a couple of terms that take off instead to describe this system. One is just the name Caesar itself, which in German is rendered as Kaiser. But then another term, of course, is imperator. This in English gets rendered as emperor. Here we get the idea of the Roman Empire. The Roman, that is a state that is imperial. It is the imperium of the emperor. Imperium basically meant state power and authority. And the symbol for imperium in Rome was the fasces. This was a bundle of sticks with an axe sticking out of it. It just comes from the word that means bundles in Latin. I believe the word for bundle in Italian, modern Italian, is fascio. And it's theorized that the reason that this is the symbol of imperium in Rome is because the rods in the bundle represent corporal punishment, the punishment of the corpus or body. And then the axe represents, of course, capital punishment, the punishment of the caput, I think, in Latin, head, decapitation, killing, basically, execution. In this way, the fasces represents the brutal enforcement of state power, and it was a very psychologically affecting symbol for the Romans. The Roman Empire was big enough, lasted for long enough, culturally innovated and iterated enough that it effectively constitutes a history reset for Europe. Everything about European history following Rome basically has its start in Rome. Rome is the great foundational myth of the European people. And for the people who are often still called Latins today, the people who speak evolved versions of Latin, the Romance languages, languages of the Romans. Rome has often served as a kind of picturesque icon of past glory that can be reinterpreted for different purposes. A primordial source of identity. So values of duty, discipline, and heroism are often ascribed to that era and can, to a degree, can be justified by the literature of the era. We certainly see this expressed as a Roman ideal in certain characters like Romulus and Scipio and Marcus Aurelius, the martial values of the state, the stoicism of Seneca, and understanding how the Roman state developed. It's very easy to understand why, in the harsh conditions it arose in, a country like Rome that had those kinds of values would be able to achieve the kind of success and domination that it maintained. However, the memory of Rome also carries with it a certain stigma of licentiousness, gluttony, and paranoia. We see this in the book I, Claudius, a popular novel from the early 20th century that was adapted into a very good British television series in the 70s. We have, for instance, the madness of Caligula, the callous debauchery of Tiberius, and, of course, the eventual kind of cessation of power in the West and the loss of territory to German warlords. This went down in legend as the beginning of Petrarch's Dark Ages, a time in which Petrarch considered himself to still be living. In the western half of the empire, places like Britain, Gaul, Spain, Italy, North Africa, Imperium slowly dissolves, or at least Imperium radiating from the city of Rome, or later on Ravenna, because at this time the Germans were under more pressure to evacuate their lands, and the Romans and their apparatus was more vulnerable than it used to be. So over time, you gradually get a situation where various lands are either given to or just conquered by German nations led by warlords. But this really only happened in the western half of the empire. So, for instance, the Visigoths created a kingdom in Spain, and the Vandals created a kingdom in North Africa. The Romans just straight up abandoned Britain, and then it became overrun with various peoples from places like Germany and Denmark, who eventually became known as the English. And then Gaul got conquered by a German people called the Franks, and from that, the name of Gaul fell out of favor, and we get the name of this kingdom called Francia, which eventually evolved into France. And what resulted from this is that the Germans brought their own Germanic customs into the governance of these various regions. Now, they did adopt a lot of the institutional infrastructure left over from the Romans, including, in many places, the Latin language, which they adopted as their own language of administration. However, they also introduced a more Germanic system of hierarchy and power that was more spoils-based, more loyalty-based, and more kinship-based. And so you got a kind of devolved power structure in the land where warlords had to rely on their family members and lesser warlords under their protection for assistance in war. And what you get from the result of the mixture of this with the old Roman institutions is a codified kind of law of the land, a new law of social organization called feudalism. Structures like European feudalism also appear in other countries, in other parts of the world in different time periods, but this is kind of how it developed in Europe after the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire. And this structure differs a lot from the more civic concepts associated with the Roman system of social organization, which actually kind of feel more modern in comparison to the medieval feudal system. Really, it feels, when you look at the classical Greek and Roman stuff, it often feels more relatable than what came in between these two eras. So Petrarch, thinking of medieval Europe as the Dark Ages, kind of makes sense when you think about it in terms of the sort of loss of the civic framework mentality, the difference between the political institutions and philosophies, and really kind of the back seat that philosophy as a whole took, because so much of philosophy in the Middle Ages became reduced to just Christianity. There was a lot of destabilization of the whole system, the whole economy, the whole power structure at this time. And a lot of the places that were most fortified were places like monasteries, and the only intact network really radiating out of the city of Rome by this point was the church, because the Roman Empire had by that point converted to Christianity. And the most important church in the empire, or, the remains of what used to be the empire, was in the city of Rome. Petrarch himself, though, the old poet laureate of Florence, represents to modern understanding, to the modern myth, a kind of new dawn in Latin history, the end of his dark ages, we could call them, called the Renaissance. The Renaissance was characterized by the rediscovery of a lot of ancient Greek and Latin texts, and the advancement of the arts and sciences, and also the development of more secular, less church-based philosophies such as humanism. The Renaissance kind of radiates out of the city of Florence in Tuscany during the late Middle Ages, and the other two writers who kind of were the main trio with Petrarch of the early Florentine Renaissance were Boccaccio and Dante. What made these writers interesting is not just the new ideas that they brought to literature, but also the fact that they tended to write in their own vernacular, in the Florentine dialect of Italian, which helped popularize Florentine Italian as a kind of literary language, and eventually led to the creation of the standard Italian language. It was more common for people to write in Latin, although at various times there were other Western European languages that were written in, such as Irish and Old English. Dante is one of the first more modern writers to write about Italy as a country and define borders for Italy. He contributes to a growing sense of what was called Italianità, a sense or a feeling of Italianness in people who lived in Italy, that Italy was a thing, a concept, a real place. Petrarch really liked ancient Rome, and he wrote a whole epic poem about it called Africa, which is about Scipio and his fight against Hannibal. It was kind of tempting to think that things were a lot better during ancient Rome, and in some ways they might have been, especially for Italy, because you had a thing called the Peace of Rome, where for a long time there really wasn't a lot of war in the actual country of Italy because of the Roman Empire. But Rome has served as a kind of ground zero for all sorts of legitimacies. And one of these legitimacies was the Catholic Church hierarchy. Catholic just means universal in Greek. It was the universal church. The church at the time was a real institution with institutional government and rules, and it still is to this day. And it was governed by bishops. And the most important of these bishops were the archbishops. And the most important archbishop in the western part of the empire, really the most influential bishop in that part of the empire, was the Bishop of Rome. And what was special about the Bishop of Rome is that his office, according to legend, had continuity going all the way back to St. Peter, the apostle who knew Jesus himself, moved to Rome during the first century. Also, if that weren't enough, the other apostle, St. Paul, who didn't personally know the human Jesus, but is still considered an apostle because he wrote all the epistles that make up the New Testament. He also lived in Rome around a similar time. And part of what defined the Bishop of Rome's sphere of influence in the West is the fact that there was a kind of cultural split in the empire that also was reflected by or reflected a political split in the empire. In the year 284, the Emperor Diocletian divided the empire in half so that it was still one empire, but it was controlled by two different kind of high emperors called Augusti, and then they had two kind of assistant emperors underneath them, the Caesars. This is a system that would kind of carry on in various ways through the rest of the empire's history. You would usually have two different emperors, one in the east and one in the west. And there was a cultural dimension to this, which is that in the east, the language of administration was Greek, and in the west, it was Latin. And this also extended to the church. The language of the church in the east was Greek. The language of the church in the west was Latin. The Bishop of Rome was the leader of all of the Latin churches. And if you hear me in this video talk about a Greek emperor, this is why. This is who I'm talking about. I'm talking about the Roman emperor who lived in the east, who lived in New Rome, also called Constantinople. Now it's Istanbul, a city in Turkey. I refer to him sometimes as the Greek emperor because he spoke Greek as the language of administration. Also, it's sometimes called the Byzantine Empire. The churches of the eastern part of the empire were more aligned with the bishops of Constantinople, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Those are the main religious centers of the East. And so the Bishop of Rome didn't really have a lot of influence in those areas. And technically, the Greek emperor was supposed to be the head of the church in Constantinople, not the bishop. But after the empire in the West fell and there was no Latin emperor anymore, then the Bishop of Rome is able to use his continuity with St. Peter to build up this idea that he is the legitimate head of the Catholic Church. The empire in the East continued on for many centuries after, really 1,000 years almost after the empire in the West fell. And in that time, as part of this positioning of his own office as the head of the church, the Bishop of Rome even created a new emperor in the West, a new Latin emperor for the Latin Church in the year 800. Because at this point, the King of France was a Frankish king named Karl. It's also the same as Charles. That's the French version of Karl. Or Carol is a kind of Latinized, Carolus. All of these are the same name. They basically mean a free man or a free peasant. But he was a very successful warlord, and he conquered a lot of areas east of the Rhine in Germany. The Bishop of Rome, who was also known as the Pope later on, he has troubles with this German people living in the north of Italy called the Langobards or Lombards. They had established a kind of kingdom and hegemony in the northern half of Italy. And the problem with that is that they seem to be heretics. They didn't quite go along with the creed of the Pope's church. They probably adhered to a heresy that was popular among German people at the time called Arianism. Not to be confused with Arianism with a Y, Arian. It's Arian, very different. It comes from a bishop named Arius who had a doctrine that said that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are three different things, and that the Father is higher than the Son, and the Son is higher than the Holy Spirit. Very different from the creed that was adopted formally by the church. But because of this, the Langobards or Lombards, they were the enemy of the Pope, and so the King of France, who adhered to the Pope's creed, he was kind of used to conquer the Lombards. He made it all the way to Rome, where the Pope rewarded him by proclaiming him emperor, the new Roman emperor. Although this new Roman Empire would be very different from the way the empire looked previously. But it was supposed to give the Pope more legitimacy and protection in the way that the Bishop of Constantinople had with his emperor. I guess that was the theory of it, but it kind of broke down over time. By the way, the Pope at this point is also a sovereign lord of his own territories called the Papal States. So he's not just a religious figure, he's also a head of state figure. The Papal States are, of course, in Italy, mostly in the central region of Italy. And Italy, at this time, kind of during the Renaissance period, and really all throughout the Middle Ages, is in a weird space politically. In the Renaissance, it develops very culturally into a very important place. But politically, the situation is very complicated because there was technically a kingdom of Italy at this point, all through the Middle Ages. It was called the Kingdom of Italy. It was first declared into existence by the German Roman officer Odovaker in the year 476. Odovaker overthrew the last of the Latin emperors of the Old Canon, named Romulus Augustulus. But instead of declaring himself the new emperor of Rome, Odovaker instead decided to follow a more Germanic custom and call himself the King of Italy, or Rex in Latin. And the theory went that he wasn't supposed to be completely separate from the empire at this point. The empire, it's not like the empire is gone and he's replacing it. It's more like he's recognizing the Greek emperor in the East as the only legitimate emperor now. And he is a king of this country that's still technically under the Greek emperor's domain. But the Greek emperor was in reality not very flattered by this deference, and he then takes some steps to remove Odovaker later on. But this is interesting because this is kind of how the crown of Italy was for a lot of its history. It was a crown of this country that existed within a bigger imperial system. Although which empire that was and what this system looked like changed over time. Slowly, the Byzantine Empire gets conquered by Muslims after the big explosion of Islam during the 7th and 8th centuries. Eventually, the main heartlands of the Greek Empire, like Greece and Anatolia, get conquered by Muslim Turks. And so with that, the Greek emperor is less and less able to exert influence over Italy. And so by the time of Charles, the first of the new emperors of the West, Charlemagne, Charles the Great, the so-called Kingdom of Italy established by Odovaker is now being ruled by these Lombards. And the crown of Italy is now the Iron Crown of the Lombards. But the Lombards are mostly in northern Italy, although they do have some territories in the south of Italy as well. When Charlemagne conquers the Lombards, he then takes this Iron Crown of the Lombards for himself, and he becomes not just emperor, but also King of Italy. So by this point, Charlemagne's empire includes France and northern Italy and Germany as well. This is probably the closest that France and Germany have ever been politically. I think the only time that really rivals this political closeness is the modern era with the European Union. Not too many generations after Charlemagne, the crown of France splits off from the imperial crown and is no longer part of the empire for the rest of history. The empire, by the way, which would later become called in the 10th century, the Holy Roman Empire, which would include Germany and northern Italy. However, during this time, the crown of Italy would increasingly really only have a symbolic significance to northern Italy, because after the fall of the old canon of emperors, a lot of these northern Italian cities, which were very wealthy and culturally advanced and had long histories, they kind of fortified themselves, and they didn't want to lose all of their, commercial opportunities that they had done so well to build up over hundreds of years. And so they all kind of developed into these really heavily fortified, isolated city-states. And that was a system that was very hard for a hegemonic power to kind of break and dominate. There were various ways in which they did that. They did kind of enforce a hegemony over the region, but they were not consistently successful. And over time, it just became clearer and clearer that these cities were in control of their own affairs. So the Kingdom of Italy wasn't really a proper kingdom. It was more of a symbolic kingdom. The various regions of northern Italy were all pretty much independent from each other, and they often fought wars with each other. And a lot of times these wars in the Middle Ages were wars fought between the emperor and the pope, because despite the whole purpose of the empire as a way to protect the pope's sort of prestige, it didn't really work out that way. Often the emperor and the pope fought each other. Originally, the Italian states which allied themselves with the popes were called Guelphs, and the ones who allied themselves with the emperors were called Ghibellines. This goes back to an old dynastic dispute in Germany that I don't have time to go into. That's where these names come from. But really, they evolved to have nothing to do with this dynastic dispute. And then eventually they evolved to really have very little to do with the Pope and the Emperor at all. And they became just these weird sort of factions that divided the cities of northern Italy. And then you had factions within factions, like during the time of Dante, there was like a civil war in Florence between the rival white Guelphs and black Guelphs. It was really convoluted. It was a really messy, very violent time in Italian history. Northern Italy had a lot of rivalries and power changes, like internal family rivalries and external wars between cities. Like everywhere you look, somebody was trying to get an edge over someone else. And you see this reflected in Shakespeare plays like Romeo and Juliet. You also see it in The Prince, which was a book by the Florentine writer Niccolò Machiavelli. It's a very cynical text about what it takes to hold on to power in a region that's so volatile. Basically saying that if you want to have power in Italy, you have to be just ruthless and immoral and cunning and always looking for opportunities to undercut people and rip them off. But through all this time, there technically was a kingdom of Italy. And usually the person who was the Kingdom of Italy was also the King of Germany. The Crown of Germany was this kind of weird fusion of a hereditary and an elected position, where the Germany was also divided among many sovereign principalities. The highest sovereigns in Germany were called electors, and they had the power to elect their king, who would then also be the emperor. So you really had three crowns, although the crown of Germany was not a literal crown that existed. It was more of an idea that was associated with the imperial crown. And so if you were the emperor, you were also most likely to be king of Germany and king of Italy. And through the Middle Ages, there was always a question of how much power the emperor actually had over these regions that were mostly self-sufficient. And that produced a lot of conflicts and wars. The emperor was kind of more like a figurehead who occupied a very confusing role in the scheme of European politics. And by the way, in case you're confused, when we talk about the Lombards and the Kingdom of Italy and Lombardy, we're not talking about the region specifically that is called Lombardy today in Italy. That's only a very small slice off of the north of Italy, with cities like Milan. The medieval Lombardy, the medieval Kingdom of Italy, was much larger than just what is called Lombardy today. However, southern Italy, was a completely different country. It's kind of like how North Korea and South Korea speak the same language but have completely different politics. Northern Italy and Southern Italy didn't speak exactly the same language, but it was similar enough. So during the 6th century, the Byzantine emperor decided to try to reconquer the West. But of course, when the Lombards came and took a lot of territories in the south, this sort of dissolved, and so you got like a mixture of Lombard and Greek ruled provinces. And then this area became even more vulnerable to attack when the Muslims invaded Sicily and conquered Sicily, turning it into an Islamic kingdom, several Islamic kingdoms. The men who capitalized on this insecurity were two Norman knights who were brothers named Robert and Roger. Now, the Normans were originally Vikings from Norway and Denmark. And basically, the way the Normans were created is that the King of France was under attack from Vikings raiding the shoreline. And this Viking named Rollo convinced the King of France to grant him a territory for him to become Duke in northern France. That territory became known as Normandy because it's named after the Northmen. So he could sort of be like a mercenary for the King of France under new feudal obligation. This Norman duchy, which of course then became a French duchy, they spoke French. They famously invaded England in the year 1066 due to a dynastic dispute with the King of England and also the King of Norway, thus changing everything about England, including its language, because they made French the language of administration for 300 years. And so gradually English became way, way more like French than it really had any right to be. That story is very famous, but it's a story for another time. There were these two Norman brothers. They conquered Sicily from the Muslims. Now, what's interesting about this is that this was only a few decades after 1053, which is when the Latin and Greek churches formally split from one another. So they are not recognizing each other at all anymore. They're totally different hierarchies, and they might as well be heretical to each other. And so now the Pope is the only legitimate leader of the so-called Catholic Church. The East are now called the Orthodox Church. And so if you'll remember, you have Lombards and you have Greeks in southern Italy. Neither of these political powers are really very much aligned with the interests of the new Catholic Church. So the Pope doesn't really have a problem when Robert and Roger want to extend their conquests beyond Muslim Sicily and into southern Italy. And in fact, the Pope even rewards them by allowing them to style themselves as counts. And eventually he rewards them even further because Roger's son, Roger II, in the year 1130, is crowned King of Sicily, which includes the island of Sicily and that area of southern Italy. And actually, due to an interesting happenstance of marriage and inheritance, the emperors, for a time, are that Norman Sicilian line of kings. Frederick Barbarossa is an emperor at this time who comes from the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, and the capital of the empire kind of unofficially is in Palermo for a while. But after some tug of war over the years, the Kingdom of Sicily eventually becomes the Kingdom of Naples, but it's essentially the same kingdom over the same territory. It just changes hands for a few times, going to the House of Aragon and the House of Habsburg, and then finally the House of Bourbon, or Bourbon in French. It's a French house. And that's why Italy looks the way it does for so much of the last millennium. The South is this sleepy little kingdom just kind of ticking along doing its own thing, while the North is this hodgepodge clusterfuck of chaos, competition, and cultural innovation. Following the discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus in 1492, you get this huge wave of cash flows coming over the Atlantic Ocean all of a sudden. And the countries that are profiting the most from these cash flows, called the Columbian Exchange, are the Atlantic countries like Portugal and Spain and France and England and the Netherlands. Whereas in the old days, a lot more of the trade was coming from the east up the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf and into the area that was mostly Turkish controlled. And so the Ottoman Empire of the Turks who conquered the Romans in the east, and also Italy, a little further down the Mediterranean, became very wealthy. But things start to change with this new world discovery. And with the new confidence in sailing technology, several people discovered that you could actually get to the Indian Ocean, where those old trade routes are coming from, by going just directly around Africa. More people started doing that at the time, and these Atlantic powers like Portugal and the Netherlands started actually developing some pretty close commercial ties and even some colonies along the African and Indian coastlines. This even more strengthened the power and influence of the Atlantic countries, kind of at the expense of places like Italy and the Ottoman Empire. The country that was really hit hard by this was Naples. Despite having a very impressively large capital city with a lot of culture in it, the Kingdom of Naples kind of suffered and stagnated a lot during this time. It became known as kind of a backwards and even a barbaric territory by a lot of people, even northern Italians. And you started to see a lot of crime, especially as it was kind of a mountainous territory, and Sicily was a very mountainous territory. And with the poverty, a lot of people turned to brigandage and became highway bandits who would then go and hide in the mountains. France, however, really benefited from these new developments because they were one of those Atlantic countries, and they eventually developed a very large, what's called colonial empire all over the world. A colonial empire is not an empire per se. It's not necessarily headed by an emperor, although it can be. Their biggest colonial rival at this time was England, which also had a very large colonial empire. England had been France's ancient rival since the 100 Years' War, which actually was a war kind of around the time of the New World discovery. And by the 18th century, England had formally united with Scotland and become one crown, so they're now known as the United Kingdom of Great Britain. This is where we start referring to them as British rather than English. So you have a kind of rivalry going on between Great Britain and France. And with all of this great trade that's flowing into Europe, you get the rise of very, very wealthy merchants. These merchants lived in the towns. Towns in various Germanic languages are sometimes called burgs. So the wealthy town folk, a lot of whom in England would be called gentry. In France, there was a term nouveau riche, but these people were known as burghers. And in France, they started to recognize these burghers as a sort of social class of their own, the bourgeois class. These people made a lot of money off of trade and had enough money to send their children to universities to get jurists' education. And so you had a lot of these sort of bourgeois people in these universities being exposed to a lot of concepts related to law and philosophy. Around the 17th century, you get the rise of a thought called rationalism. Another early term for it is Cartesianism, from the philosopher René Descartes. This is an idea that really tries to get to the core of what we're talking about when we deal with natural philosophy, which is the old term for science. And Descartes believed that it was pretty important to not just believe things unless you had evidence that they were true. And at the time, you also get the rise of Protestantism because people are kind of following a similar instinct. They are questioning the traditional Catholic Church hierarchy, especially as the hierarchy is proving more and more corrupt. And you're getting people wanting to read the original biblical texts and come out with their own interpretation of these texts. Protestantism really takes off in Germany and the Netherlands, and England kind of has another weird sort of relationship with Protestantism because of King Henry VIII, but they technically also become Protestants, although they maintain an episcopal system, a bishop-based system. But with this kind of Protestant religious change, these countries, England, the Netherlands, and Switzerland, also develop a kind of Protestant politics, a skeptical politics in a way, a self-reliant anti-authoritarian politics that goes along with the sort of independent anti-Catholic religion that they were following. And so ideas associated with rational thought, ideas about the sort of, well, bourgeois ideas, you could say. Ideas radiating out of the nouveau riche class, the new wealthy people who didn't have a stake in the old feudal order. They were not aristocrats per se, they were a different thing who wanted to be independent. And so new concepts like freedom and consent and federalism became very popular in these territories. However, the Latin countries were doing different things because they maintained allegiance with the Catholic Church for the most part. Although Romania was never really in that crowd, they had a Romanian Orthodox Church. The Kingdom of France was pushing in a different direction politically, but still one that was oriented around resolving an old problem. All over Europe, the traditional feudal system was becoming more and more obsolete because of the rise of this kind of reliance on merchant trade and other various factors that I don't have time to go into. The real money wasn't coming out of the traditional feudal agriculture the way it used to, and kings wanted more power and control. France's most illustrious king was Louis XIV, head of the House of Bourbon. Yes, the same house that ruled over both Spain and Naples. And Louis XIV became what is called an absolute monarch. This means he wrested control away from the local nobility of France by inviting them all to live at his new pleasure palace in Versailles, where he could keep an eye on them and also entertain them and distract them. And in case you were wondering if this would distract the nobles away from their traditional feudal obligation to raise armies for the king in times of war, this again had a clever solution. It was becoming more and more common for nobles to not actually do any fighting, and instead of directly raising armies for the king, they would just give their feudal obligation in the form of money that the king could use to raise his own armies. And in fact, the king himself kind of eventually stopped doing a lot of fighting. And so this evolved into a system where the king would just kind of have an army at all times, called a standing army, where soldiery became a profession, and units of soldiers would respond to each other in standard formations of rank. So the whole idea of the absolutist system was that King Louis XIV would have all of the power in the country. The whole state would be absorbed into his person and his personal decision-making capabilities, as well as whatever minister he might have had in charge. But it's important to realize that this was an organic system. It grew naturally out of feudalism rather than being a sort of revolutionary upset to the feudal order. It was a little bit different from how things happened in England, where in 1689, they had a revolution where the Parliament, or Council of Lords and Gentry, took power away from the king. Great Britain would not be an absolute monarchy. They would be a parliamentary or constitutional monarchy, following principles of liberality related to the concepts of liberty and independence from a despotic monarch. These ideas of English liberality had a very big influence on the British American colonists. And they were also influenced by certain French traditions of liberality, because there was a French tradition of this sort of thing developing at the same time. French people were passing around a lot of liberal and even atheistic ideas inspired by René Descartes, although Descartes was not himself an atheist. Cartesian Freudian rationalism inspired a kind of thought where a lot of people were turning away from belief in God. While not precisely a liberal himself, a popular writer in France, Voltaire, made fun of the Catholic Church a lot. He also made fun of the Holy Roman Empire, calling it not holy, not Roman, and not an empire, which is kind of funny because it is kind of true. The writings of Montesquieu, a slightly less radical writer, also had a big impression on the American colonists, as well as the work of the French-Swiss writer Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau very much emphasized ideas of liberty and the social contract, the idea that a social organization should be broadly consented to, or that it exists because people feel the need to enter into agreements with each other, whether these agreements are consensual or not. But then the ideal from that becomes an idea that people should have the right to consent to these agreements. This period of thought is famously called the Enlightenment. The events of this time are kind of famous because we get taught a lot about this kind of stuff in school, like how, for instance, the French lost the 7 Years' War against Great Britain in the 1740s and 50s, which had a really bad effect on the French treasury. Part of it is that they lost all of their North American colonies to Great Britain and Spain. And then the French also supported the American colonists in their revolution against Great Britain, which also impacted the treasury. You get economic downturns in France, which result in a lot of poverty at the bottom, while the wealthy at the top are not experiencing a lot of strain. You've all heard this story before. The contradictions between the actual state of French politics with its old sort of archaic inefficiencies and the new culture of France, the new bourgeois sector with their interest in rationalism. These contradictions were very potent. So severely potent that I would say a revolution was imminent. And this is not just hindsight talking. England had already had 2 revolutions by this point, not counting the American one. And yet, and this is key, the French Revolution was earth-shattering in a way that no revolution before really was, not even the American one. Because the French Revolution opened up the door to a new kind of politics, extreme political radicalism. It created the conditions for so-called left-wing thought to develop in France. The terms left and right come from the French Revolution. They come from specifically what side of the convention house that the delegates sat on in 1789. The more conservative delegates sat on the right side, and the more reformist delegates sat on the left. The most left-wing of all reformers were the so-called Jacobin Club. Jacobin or Jacobin. They wore a red cap as their symbol, which kind of led to the adoption of the color red as associated with revolution and the left wing. The goals of the Jacobin Club were to abolish the Catholic Church and abolish the monarchy, get rid of the king altogether and proclaim a republic. Now, these sound like pretty astronomical goals, especially abolishing the Catholic Church. But the crazy thing about this is that they actually did these things. This was not just a fringe segment of the left that sort of badgered the more moderates in the party. No, these people took over the government. It was a baffling, sudden left-wing takeover of a country, the first of its kind. And it was kind of terrifying to a lot of people, even just to normal Catholics who wanted to go to Mass, but suddenly they couldn't because the government is saying no. I guess another way of putting it is that, you know how I said that the Roman Empire was a cultural reset for Europe? Well, the French Revolution was another one. In fact, I kind of debated whether to just start the story here, but I figured that the context leading up to it was pretty important. If nothing else, just to establish why this moment was so earth-shaking. They didn't just get rid of the king, by the way, they murdered him. They killed the king, which even Great Britain was very upset about, and they had been the traditional rival of the Bourbon King of France. And furthermore, the English had done that same thing to their king in 1649. They had killed, they decapitated their king. So talk about hypocrisy, but the British were not happy that the French killed their king. And moreover, they were not happy because it went along with everything else. This radical Jacobin takeover of the government was just not appreciated by most people in Europe. It was viewed as a very upsetting situation that could have ripple effects in the rest of the continent. And so in a stunning turn of events, Great Britain actually switched sides. They joined with their traditional enemy, the Bourbon regime of France, the Ancien Régime, as it's called in French. And so did a bunch of other countries. Obviously, the other Bourbon kingdoms of Spain and Naples were on board, but also the Holy Roman Empire, Germany. The empire at this time was being led by the House of Habsburg, which was the house traditionally associated with the Kingdom of Austria. Now, the Habsburgs and the Bourbons also were kind of enemies for a long time, or rivals at least. But in the 7 Years' War, I think, they kind of got along together and fought on the same side. This only really strengthened their bond. And now the houses of Bourbon and Habsburg were very, very much linked together, especially because the Queen of France was a Habsburg, Marie Antoinette. Another important country in the Holy Roman Empire that joined in this war against the new French Republic was Prussia. Prussia was the biggest kingdom in Germany other than Austria. They were ruled by the Hohenzollern family. And then there was also a kingdom in northern Italy called the Kingdom of Sardinia. This was ruled by the House of Savoy, who lived in the territory of northern Italy called Piedmont. Now, the thing about Prussia and Piedmont is their names didn't really reflect where the main centers of their kingdom were. Like, the main center of the Prussian kingdom was not Prussia, it was Brandenburg, with its capital in Berlin. And the main center of Sardinia was not the island of Sardinia, it was Piedmont, with its capital in Turin. The reason they called themselves the kingdoms of Prussia and Sardinia is because their main power locuses were in the Holy Roman Empire, and so they couldn't be kings in the Holy Roman Empire because that would go against the sort of imperial custom. But they had these territories like Prussia and Sardinia, which were outside of the empire, so they could be kings in those territories, and that's why you get this weird situation. But I'll probably call the Kingdom of Sardinia Piedmont for most of this video. But all of these countries joined together in this moment to fight a war against the French Republic. They all found it important to stem the flow of this political radicalism, to take down the Republicans and reinstall the King of France. Of course, it wouldn't be the same king because the king was murdered, and so it would be... And it wasn't his son, Louis XVII, either, because Louis XVII died in jail. So it would have to be Louis XVI's little brother, who would be Louis XVIII. Because all of these powers were reacting against the tide of revolution, they are known collectively as reactionaries. The mission of the new republic was then to combat the reactionaries both inside and outside of France. Of course, there's all this talk about political radicalism, you know, the new ideas of the Jacobins. But the Jacobins were intent on not just being perceived as some new, bizarre aberration in the world, because they themselves were very inspired by the ancient classics. Like I said, ancient Rome with its civic overtones kind of feels more modern in comparison to feudalism. They were really inspired by the kind of republican institutions of the Romans and the democracy of Athens. Many Jacobins even took nicknames from the ancient classics. They wanted to be perceived as new Romans, having a very different idea, a more pagan idea of what it meant to be Roman than, for instance, the Holy Roman Empire with its associations with the Catholic Church of Rome. And with these new associations, innovations, the revival of classical architectural style, that neoclassical style became very much in vogue in this time in history. The Americans especially took to this style, and the Americans also especially took to these new Roman principles. A lot of Frenchmen really admired what the Americans had done with their new republic, and in fact, one of the principal authors of the French Revolution of 1789, and one of the authors of the kind of founding document of that revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, was the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette was a veteran of the American Revolution and a friend of George Washington. One of these new Romans of the Jacobin Club was François Noël Babeuf. He went by the nickname Gracchus Babeuf after the famous populist Tiberius Gracchus. Gracchus Babeuf had some interesting ideas. He was skeptical of bourgeois politics, and he didn't like the whole idea of property as the basis of a commonwealth. In fact, he thought that private property was the thing that was keeping people oppressed. And so in 1796, Gracchus Babeuf led a revolution against his own colleagues. A failed revolution where he tried to abolish private property. This was called the Conspiracy of Equals. He thought it wasn't enough just to get rid of aristocratic privilege as the Jacobins had done in the Republic. They needed to also get rid of the system of property altogether that produced this kind of privilege in no matter what form it came. That you would only end up with a new aristocracy after getting rid of the old one, as long as this institution of property maintained hegemony. This is a remarkable turning point, because before this point, there really isn't much of a difference between the bourgeois politics and the proletarian politics. In fact, there really wasn't much of a proletarian politics at all, a politics of the poor, outside of occasions where in very pointed circumstances, they might have a protest or a rebellion for certain reasons, sometimes religious reasons, or because they're just under a lot of economic hardship at a certain time, or because they're led in a certain direction by a certain wealthier political interest. So you get stuff like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, or around the same time you get the Ciompi Rebellion in Florence. You can point to a lot of earlier examples of proletarian uprisings, even going back to the ancient Roman Republic. The first ever strike in recorded Italian history happened around the years 495 and 494 BC in the Roman Republic. The poor people going on strike because they were under too much debt and they didn't want to fight in the Latin War. But as far as a political theory of the poor, there really wasn't much until this point with the Conspiracy of Equals. But it's in the early 19th century that you start to see left-wing thinkers really start to kind of codify the idea of poor person politics as a perennial issue and a consistent social concern. But around the time of the Conspiracy of Equals, the war, of course, is going on, the war of the reactionaries trying to take down the Republic. And one of the generals hired by the Republic, because they needed new people. A lot of them had fled. A lot of them were aristocrats, a lot of the generals. So they needed a lot of new people, and you got a lot of new hiring opportunities. And one person who was able to take advantage of the new opportunities was this Corsican general named Napoleon Bonaparte. He was Corsican, so his original name was Napoleone Bonaparte, but then, moving to France as a kid, he Frenchified his name a bit. But Napoleon Bonaparte was the most gifted general in France. And he showed that very early on in his earliest assignments. His first big assignment was given to him for the command of the French army in Italy. Because remember, one of the reactionary powers was the kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia. It was kind of convenient that his assignment was Italy because, well, being Corsican, his language that he grew up speaking was very similar to the Ligurian dialect of Italian, which was pretty similar to the Piedmontese dialect of Italian. So going into those areas, he was able to talk to the locals as a native. He conquered Piedmont. The king of Piedmont had to go to Sardinia. He also conquered Genoa and other parts of Italy. in the north of Italy, he, in the Jacobin style, creates little sort of Jacobin republics for the Italian people. These are republics that are under France's sway, under France's sphere of influence. Around this time, the Italian Republicans start celebrating this sort of victory of republicanism in Italy by waving banners in imitation of the French Revolutionary tricolor flag. But instead of the color blue, they use green for some reason. I don't know why. But this red, white, and green variant of the French tricolor flag then becomes kind of a symbol for Italian republicanism, hence power to the Italian people and Italianità as a whole. And this is really where people start imagining the idea of creating a united Italian Republic. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte, coming back from an expedition in Egypt, promoted himself from general to first consul. Now, consuls were basically like the prime ministers of the Roman Republic, but it differed a little bit from the Roman ideal, because in the Roman idea, there were two consuls, and they both had equal power over the republic. In Napoleon's new constitution, the first consul, which is what he was, would have basically all the power, and the second consul would be like an advisory consul, sort of like the president and vice president. The way Napoleon accomplished this is pretty famous, of course. He went into the assembly house with his soldiers and physically intimidated the deputies into approving a new constitution where he would be temporary consul until he could get formally elected later. And he did. This office of first consul was more similar to the Roman office of dictator, which was a temporary office that they would sometimes establish if they needed really strong control from one person in a time of war. You would kind of suspend certain laws if needed. Taking it a step further, a few years later in 1804, he held another plebiscite, another election, where he was approved to promote himself from first consul all the way up to this new office called Emperor of the French. This would be a dynastic office. And in becoming Emperor of the French, Napoleon Bonaparte also takes up that dusty old crown of the Lombards and becomes King of Italy. And so again, we see this pattern where the crown of Italy exists, but it exists inside a bigger imperial system, just like with the Holy Roman Empire. By the way, the Holy Roman Empire was on its way out at this point. Because Napoleon was fighting a lot of wars in the Holy Roman Empire, he was conquering a lot of the empire's territory. In 1806, the emperor basically transforms his imperial crown from being over like that whole area of Germany and Italy to just being the emperor of his own sovereign territories of Austria, which also included Hungary. So he goes from being the emperor to just being the emperor of Austria, which is interesting because this is 2 years after Napoleon becomes emperor of the French. So it's sort of like we're establishing a new idea that you can be an emperor just of your own sovereign territory, although technically you already have that with Russia. But the idea of empire is changing. But yeah, just like with the Holy Roman Empire, the crown of Italy now exists under a bigger imperial crown, and the emperor himself is the king of Italy. However, unlike with the Holy Roman Empire, now the crown of Italy was actually freaking worth something, because now you could govern with it, and Napoleon did. And if that weren't enough, Napoleon also pushed the King of Naples down into Sicily and took southern Italy for himself as well and gave it to his family members. So now, for the first time since ancient Rome, the countries of France and mainland Italy were both united under the rule of one single emperor, an emperor who could be, fittingly, both French and Italian, depending on how you look at it. Napoleon, like the other Jacobins, was interested in the ancient classics, although he was a slightly different model of New Roman, more Caesar than Gracchus. Napoleon marks a development of and a change of direction in revolutionary symbolism, in much the same way as he does with revolutionary politics more generally. Under the Jacobins, revolutionary heroes, ancient or modern, personified abstract values such as courage, dignity, and selfless service to the Republic, which were meant to inspire and encourage popular emulation. With Napoleon, however, revolutionary symbolism had a more simple purpose. It was used to glorify his personal power and enhance the process of his self-legitimation. The cult of the hero was no longer identified with a collective ideal, but became a purpose in itself. Art became a tool in Napoleonic propaganda. Neoclassicism ceased to have an educative function and was appropriated and recast as a decorative and architectural style, which recalled the florid opulence of imperial Rome. And history, ancient Rome, along with the Merovingian and Carolingian monarchies, and Renaissance painting, was plundered for sources to represent Napoleonic power. Napoleon himself posed as a man of literature and learning, a patron of the arts, as well as a fierce warrior and a tireless ruler. The pantheon of dead Republican brothers was reduced to one living great man. The fusion of authoritarian and traditional symbols of power with those of revolution, and its concentration into one living ruler, the emperor, filled the symbolic vacancy caused by the French Revolution. Although foreshadowed in many ways by the aesthetic ideals and totalizing practices of Jacobinism, Napoleon's shift towards authoritarianism and dictatorship is generally seen as definitive, marking a decisive rightward turn in the symbols and rituals of mass politics. One of the other countries in the newly incorporated French Empire was the Kingdom of Holland, which Napoleon gave to his little brother Luigi, who by this point was going as Louis. King Louis of Holland said of this experience, "From the moment I set foot on the soil of the kingdom, I became a Dutchman." And he ruled the country likewise, learning Dutch himself and always siding with Dutch interests over those of the French, much to the chagrin of his brother the Emperor. In fact, the disagreement between Emperor Napoleon and King Louis got so intense that in 1810, King Louis just decided to give up and abdicate his crown to his son, Napoleon Louis. But Uncle Napoleon then stepped in after that and quickly annexed the country of Holland just directly into France, the way he had done with Piedmont earlier. But King Louis of Holland also had another son named Louis Napoleon, not to be confused with Napoleon Louis. Louis Napoleon was only 2 years old when his brother briefly became the King of Holland, and he was only 7 years old when his family, the Bonaparte family, was finally ejected from the halls of power by the dreaded reactionaries. Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and by this point, Russia. In overthrowing the emperor, the other countries of Europe attempted a hard reset to the old institutions, although that was kind of impossible. So much of the institutional infrastructure had been destroyed by the Republican and imperial governments of France. And so a lot of concessions had to be made to the new way of doing things. Like, for instance, the King of France had to adopt a constitution. I know. Napoleon had driven the Bourbon dynasty not just out of France, not just out of southern Italy and into Sicily, but also out of Spain. The Bourbon dynasty was not having a great time, but they all came back after they exiled him to St. Helena, and the House of Savoy came back to rule Piedmont. So things were looking relatively back to normal. although they weren't. I mean, for one thing, Austria took a nice little thick slice off the top, but we'll get into that later. In ideological terms, what changed during the Empire period was we get the rise of a new political ideology. Well, it's not really new, but it's a political ideology. It's codified. It's called liberalism. I mean, there had been a liberality in the past, but there wasn't a liberalism yet. And that was created in Spain, really in reaction to the French. There were Spanish rebels who didn't want Napoleon's brother Joseph to be the king, but they also didn't like the old king of Spain. They just wanted to be in charge of the country themselves. They wanted to preserve some of the commercial and political gains that they had made under the French Empire and expand on them without ceding ground back to the old reactionaries. A key feature of the Spanish liberalismo was the limited franchise. The limited franchise restricted the right to vote to only men of a certain level of property. This was a system that actually worked to pretty good success in the United States of America. And of course, it had a precedent going all the way back to the Centuriate Assembly of ancient Rome. So the new European liberals of the Spanish model really wanted a restricted franchise. They wanted government to be restricted to men of property, to the bourgeois sector. They were basically codifying a version of moderate left-wing politics. Not quite Jacobin, not even quite Republican, but not reactionary either. However, other people were a little bit more proletarian in spirit, taking more after the model of Gracchus Babeuf. These people increasingly interested themselves in the so-called social question. The idea that there was a serious problem happening with the growing poverty and the rising tide of industry in Europe. The beginning of the Industrial Revolution was happening in Great Britain in the late 18th century, and it was slowly spreading into the rest of Europe during this time. And this social phenomenon had a lot of critics. Critics who thought, like Babeuf, that the rational program of the Jacobins and their desire to destroy the aristocracy should be extended to aristocracies in whatever manner they manifest. So these people became known not as liberals, but rather as radicals. And the distinction between the liberals and the radicals grew even stronger in the 1820s when you had the French utopians come around. These were writers like Charles Fourier, the first man to ever call himself a feminist, and Henri de Saint-Simon, the French radical who coined the term socialism to describe this growing concern for the social question and what to do about it. Henri de Saint-Simon wanted to create a more rational society, an intentional society, a society kind of created rather than just grown organically. And in his mind, this was a society of scientists where science would be valued more than anything else, and a society with equal rights for women. Another member of this movement was not French, but Scottish proprietor named Robert Owen. Humanism had gotten people away from just purely church-based thinking for a while, but it's really in the early 19th century that we get humanism turning into romanticism, the evaluation of a person's emotions and emotional experience as a very important part, or even the most important part of life. I think the rise of the popular novel with people like Jane Austen was also part of this movement. You know, people focusing more on the intimate emotional experiences of life rather than, you know, big grand things. So here we have socialism. This is one half of the synthesis in development right here. But the other half, of course, is the nationalism. Nationalism had a slightly more uneven identity at first, but the real coining of the term nationalism as an ism kind of happened around the same time as socialism. With the collapse of the old feudal order, which had already been declining under the absolutist regimes, but really burst like a bubble during the French Revolution, A new concept of polity was needed. Under the old system, everything was very hierarchical, everything was very devolved. Politics was based more on family, loyalty, and kinship ties, and religious orders. It wasn't so much a cultural politics as it was a religious politics. Things like linguistic differences mattered less back then to maintaining the social order. A lot of this is because there wasn't really a mass literary culture at the time. There wasn't printing until pretty late into history. There were no newspapers. Ordinary people were not expected to be really involved in politics unless they were involved in guild politics of the cities. That's a thing I'll talk a little bit more about in a future episode. So in other words, there wasn't really much of a need to find a language to engage ordinary people with, a political language for the masses. Social organization really happened through parish churches. Although because kings ruled over set geographical areas, it was convenient if their vassals and agents and officials could communicate to each other in a common vernacular. There was a coherence of language norms sometimes within kingdoms or polities, but it wasn't standardized and it wasn't very identitarian. Nationality was a little bit more incidental to politics and less instrumental. However, as kingdoms became more centralized and more power was concentrated in smaller places, a new approach to things was needed because the concepts of state and realm took on a little bit more of an institutional character. And like I said, there was a lot more education at this time. There was more need to kind of rationalize and justify the existence and the purpose of these systems. Hence, we get like people like Thomas Hobbes, for instance, really kind of codifying the absolutist doctrine in Great Britain. But a greater need for a core concept of the state was needed. The idea of the nation state eventually proved a pretty convenient and adaptable one for this purpose, although it was much more popular among left-wing people, among liberals and radicals. The idea of the nation-state would catch on more and more over time with conservatives and monarchists, but that was more something that happened as the 19th century progressed. To liberals and radicals, the idea of the nation state was a very progressive idea that strengthened the democratic principle by identifying the state structure with the people it ruled over. People weren't subjects anymore, they were citizens. There was an implicit understanding of a kind of participatory membership, an entitlement as a citizen. The First Republic of France really needed this concept of fraternity in order to legitimize its leadership. Fraternity, brotherhood, a brotherhood among people who had a certain kinship, but this kinship could not be family-based because it had to be much broader than that. So we get this idea of the French people, the people who speak French, as a nation and a brotherhood. That becomes the basis of legitimacy for the state. And eventually, to conservatives and monarchists, this idea could be used as a way to kind of bind people in allegiance to an already extant state structure by playing to a sense of identity that was expanded beyond mere religion and into kind of a more secular identitarian framework. Such a thing was needed more and more in the 19th century, especially as, like, you know, these romantic ideas and that the mass printing culture became more and more important. However, as I said, conservatives and monarchists were a little bit slow on the uptake of nationalism, and it took a while for this to move from beyond being just kind of a more of a left-wing strain of thought. Also, kind of like how before socialist became the term to use, they called themselves radicals and were called radicals. Before nationalist was the term, you more often saw the word patriot. And a patriot, you know, that's a looser term. It has more applicability, I think. It's less distinctly codified in the same way that radical is less distinctly codified than socialist. But the key idea of socialism is that property in some way, in some form, would be held in common. The key idea of nationalism was that the country would be governed by and for the nation as a whole, rather than for the caprices of an unaccountable king. Speaking of which, the new Fat Louis, who is an even fatter and more grotesque imitation of his predecessor, and his religious stick-in-the-mud brother, Charles X, proved far too odious for the liberals and radicals of France, and so in 1830, they held another French Revolution to dislodge the House of Bourbon for good. They were actually gone this time. But what to replace them with was another question. The Americans were doing quite well, and many Frenchmen thought it would be a good idea to copy the American model and do a presidential republic with perhaps the Marquis de Lafayette as the nation's first president. I mean, who better to be the George Washington of France than a man who actually was friends with George Washington? But Lafayette was not really into this idea. I mean, of course, he liked the American system, but what he saw with France was that they were like really teetering on the edge here. I mean, the last time they tried to do a revolution, it was a total disaster, and all the countries of Europe turned against them. What he thought France needed more than anything else was stability, and so his mind was looking toward Great Britain. It had been over 100 years since Great Britain had a revolution. They had been doing pretty well with a parliamentary regime and a monarchy. So this is where his mind is at. He's like, a constitutional monarchy would probably be the most stable thing for France. And the candidate that Lafayette proposed to be the new king of France was actually related to the Bourbon kings. It was a family member, the Duke of Orleans, named Louis Philippe. So it's not like they were going to go like totally create a new dynasty like the Bonapartes, you know. They were keeping it within the family. That would look good to outside observers. It would also look good to some inside observers. And Louis Philippe had revolutionary credit. I mean, he fought with the French, you know, on the French side during the War of the First Revolution. So he could be seen as kind of a realistic compromise at this time. It's kind of like, you know how England, they did their first revolution in 1649 where they cut the head off the king and then they created this republic headed by Oliver Cromwell. And then that didn't really work for them, so they brought back the king, and then they did another revolution in 1689 where they just kind of replaced the king with a different king. And it was a softer revolution and a more successful revolution. I think that's the idea that we're getting at here with this 1830 French Revolution. The really hardcore solution that we tried before didn't work, so let's try a softer one. And King Louis Philippe was very conscious of his role in all of this and wanted to kind of be a progressive king for France. The citizen king is what he was called. He also called himself King of the French rather than King of France. The same thing that Napoleon had done, Emperor of the French rather than Emperor of France. It's this kind of, this proto-nationalist idea of identifying the state with its people rather than just thinking of the state as this land that's owned by this sovereign who can do whatever he wishes with it and his subjects. These are not subjects anymore, they're citizens, and this is very important. But this revolution of 1830 is very important because it triggers the Italians, and specifically it triggers the Italian nationalist movement. And as far as I know, this is the 1830s in Italy is the first time you get this whole political movement that explicitly calls itself nationalist. So in a way you could kind of say that socialism is French, nationalism is Italian, although really Italian nationalism was kind of an infusion of French Jacobinism into Italy. So you get a lot of rebels in Italy who are starting to riot, encouraged by the happenings going on in France, including in the Kingdom of Naples. And the King of Naples, of course, you know, he's in the same family as the family that was just ejected from France. So he's not feeling good about this whole situation. But at this point, there's nothing he can really do about it anymore. And he's got so much rioting going on in his own country that he has to deal with. He can't even worry about the French. However, the real epicenter of revolutionary activity in Italy was in the north. Going back to the days of the French Empire, there had been in Italy this secret society of rebels called the Carbonari, or charcoal burners. And when I say secret society, I mean hardcore secret society. These people did not want to be known about. They had initiation rituals just like the Freemasons, and they were conspiratorial. They wanted to overthrow governments with small conspiracies of men. Very similar to the ideology of a French revolutionary socialist who was coming up at this time named Louis-Auguste Blanqui. Not to be confused with Louis Blanc. Louis Blanc was a famous democratic socialist politician. Louis-Auguste Blanqui was a revolutionary socialist. And Louis-Auguste Blanqui wanted basically to have a revolutionary elite that was like a small group of really educated people who knew what to do. They would, through kind of devious means, take control of the government and then create socialism from the top down. This is in the age when this kind of conspiratorial revolutionary activity was becoming very popular. And in Italy, the Carbonari acquired a lot of membership in the 1830s, including one Carbonaro named Giuseppe Mazzini. He was the most important of the Carbonari, but I'll talk about him specifically a little bit later. But what's interesting about the Carbonari is that they wanted not just to free Italy from the dominance of the reactionary powers, but also to unite Italy into a new constitutional republic. And if you'll believe it, one of these Carbonari was Napoleon Louis. If you'll remember, Napoleon Louis briefly became the King of Holland when his father, King Louis, abdicated in 1810. Since then, he had moved with his father to Rome, where they had lived for a long time. And Napoleon Louis got really interested in radical Italian politics, and he got initiated into the Carbonari of Rome. In 1830, the Bonaparte family was in a strange spot because they thought that maybe with the revolution, they might be let back into France because they had been exiled by the previous regime. However, that did not happen. King Louis Philippe actually continued their exile. He renewed their exile officially. So they were not allowed back into France. So Napoleon Louis is in Rome. And then in 1830, while this whole thing is going down, his younger brother, Louis Napoleon, comes to visit him in Rome. There's all this excitement, there's all this kind of riotous energy in the city, and the two brothers get swept up in it. They get involved in the revolutionary activity in Rome. They get kicked out of the Papal States because of this and move to Florence. And then they get kicked out of Florence. They become these like roving romantic revolutionary brothers. And by this point, you have to understand what's going on in Italy, why they're so mad. As I said, after the fall of Napoleon, Austria had taken a very thick slice off the top of Italy. They had taken the territories of Lombardy and Venetia in the north. But in addition to that, the Habsburg family of Austria had family members who made up the dukes of northern Italy. You had 3 Habsburg duchies going from north to south: Parma, Modena, and then the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, all of which were Habsburg ruled. And then below that, in the south, you have the Papal States in the middle, and then the Kingdom of Naples at the bottom. All of these countries are under the influence of the Emperor of Austria and his Chancellor Clemens von Metternich. And Austria has express military access to every part of Italy. So in effect, Italy in its entirety is a satellite country of the Austrian Empire. Clemens von Metternich, the Chancellor of Austria, was one of the most important men of the 19th century. He was basically the man of establishment European politics in the first half of the century. He was even in charge of all the foreign affairs going on when Napoleon was exiled. He goes that far back. And Clemens von Metternich really disliked nationalism. He thought it was a subversive and liberal ideology that threatened to disintegrate the empire that he had worked so hard to build. Austria was a multinational empire, as it's called. It had many different people speaking many different languages in it. Nationalism not only threatened to take Italy away from Austrian control, but to just disintegrate the empire as a whole. Metternich also really hated the Freemasons. He thought they were part of this overall problem of these conspiratorial subversives trying to undermine his regime. One of Metternich's policies was called amalgamation. And this was basically the idea that after the fall of Napoleon, yes, you can go back to the way things used to be, but feel free to keep whatever works from the Empire period. Feel free to keep whatever changes Napoleon made that you might want to keep around. You know, stuff like tax collecting and weights and measures and legal codes, you know, things that standardized stuff that before was very non-standard and confusing and difficult to work with. Because Metternich and other politicians of the reactionary camp, you know, they might not have liked Napoleon, but they had to admit Napoleon was a darn good structural reformer. His apparatus just simply ran better. It was better for business, and it was more in line with the absolutist doctrine of the state, which is what people like Metternich were aiming for. Napoleon was really just a blunt force that came in and just wiped the slate clean. All of the problems of feudalism in the Middle Ages that the absolute monarchies were kind of slowly trying to, you know, etch away at, Napoleon just kind of leveled it. So it really was a new era. It was a clean break, and it was a way for people to kind of, you know, make hay out of a bad situation. Weirdly enough, it's like Napoleon was actually a net benefit to them in the end. Although, not really the end. In the middle, we should say. I would say that Napoleon probably had the biggest role in destabilizing the regime in the long run. And a lot of this was psychological. Groups like the Spanish liberals and the Carbonari come up because of Napoleon's conquests. In a reaction against Napoleon a lot of the time, but still because of him. Napoleon did more damage to feudalism than any person in history, and he did more for nationalism than any person in history. That's the double-sided coin that Metternich is frustrated with. Metternich thought that Giuseppe Mazzini, remember that Carbonaro I talked about earlier? He thought that Giuseppe Mazzini was the most dangerous man in all of Europe. He doesn't look too dangerous to me. Giuseppe Mazzini was a Genoese journalist who became a professional revolutionary during the 1830s. But during that time, he broke ties with the Carbonari and formed his own organization called Young Italy. Unlike the Carbonari, which was a secret society, Young Italy would also carry out their work in secret, but they would be an open-facing society. They wanted people to know about them, and they had a newspaper to publicize their work and everything. The manifesto of Young Italy begins with the sentence, "Too much time has hitherto been spent in words among us, too little in act." Mazzini wants to synthesize thought with action, specifically violent action, insurrection. And in his efforts to organize revolts throughout Italy, Mazzini did act, but with little tangible success. From his position in exile during the 1830s and 1840s, he organized numerous revolts and rebellions, which all ended in imprisonment, capture, and death of their perpetrators. However, Mazzini was not discouraged by this. He was playing a long game, a psychological game, and importantly, a game that had precedent, because in the 1820s and 30s, Greece had waged a war of independence against the Ottoman Empire and won, and a big part of their strategy ended up being getting a lot of the sympathy and support from the international community. So Mazzini thought that the martyrs to the Italian cause would only strengthen international recognition of the Italian independence movement, and strengthen the internal commitment of Italy to this movement, so that over time, the psychological force of Young Italy would become unstoppable. I guess it was a neat idea at the time, but it kind of raises a few alarm bells these days. There's a reason why Metternich thought this guy was particularly dangerous. As for what the liberation of Italy should look like, Mazzini had a few concrete points to propose. He said, 1. One republic undivided across the whole territory of Italy, independent, united, and free. 2. The destruction of the entire upper hierarchy of the clergy and the introduction of a simple parish system. 3. The abolition of all aristocracy and every privilege which is not the result of the eternal law of capacity and action. 4. An unlimited encouragement of public education. 5. The most explicit declaration of the rights of man and the citizen. So here we have Mazzini very much in Jacobin temperament here. We have, the abolition of the upper clergy, the abolition of aristocracy, and equal rights for man. And this is a message he took outside of Italy as well, going to Switzerland and creating another organization called Young Europe, which would spread the ideas of Young Italy out into the world, eventually making it to Ireland, where you get the Young Ireland movement, which actually had some amount of currency there. This is a part of Mazzini's strategy of international outreach. And it's not actually an entirely self-serving strategy either, because Mazzini's concept of nationalism was actually very international. It was very cosmopolitan. In fact, one of his essays is titled Nationality and Cosmopolitanism. For Mazzini, the cause of nationality and republicanism was universal. Every nation should and could pursue these same ends. He thought that republics of free citizens would be natural allies, and so every nation should strive to create its own republican nation state, so that they could all get along and be friends with each other. He thought it would be natural for republics of free men to get along with each other, in contrast with the kind of avarice that was associated with absolutist regimes like Austria. He thought freedom would naturally produce a desire for cooperation, with some caveat, and that caveat got expanded on a little bit later, and I'll talk about that in episode 2 of this series. But he thought Italy was the perfect kind of starting place for this movement that would extend all over the world. He thought Italy would be like the spiritual leader of this movement, to set the first major example of how to do this right. You might say the United States, but remember, the United States had a limited franchise, and that was something that Mazzini thought was like really, really bad for a republic. And the United States also had slavery, which again, Mazzini thought was really, really bad. But another question you might have is why he called it Young Italy or Young Europe. What's with this word young? Well, Mazzini thought that young people were the key for reinventing society, that the youth had a certain earnestness and passion, a certain energy, and a fearless optimism that Mazzini thought would be important for rejuvenating society. And he wanted the Republic of Italy to be a rejuvenated Italy, an Italy made young again, giving it a new sense of unity, purpose, and strength. This was an era when the transnational revolutionary really took off. Lafayette was an early example of this. A lot of young people going off to different countries to fight in wars in countries that they weren't even a part of. Lord Byron in Greece is a very famous example of this, and in their own way, in a slightly touristy way, you also have the Dutch Bonaparte brothers getting involved in revolutionary activity in Italy in the early 1830s. Although sadly, very tragically, when the two brothers were trying to escape Italy in 1831, Napoleon Louis came down with the measles and he died. And that left Louis Napoleon as the eldest of his line of the Bonaparte family. And that wouldn't have been so meaningful if another upset hadn't happened the next year in 1832. In 1832, the only legitimate son of the Emperor Napoleon, Napoleon II, also died. And that meant that if anyone was interested in restoring the Bonaparte dynasty, they would either have to look to one of Napoleon's brothers or the sons of Napoleon's brothers. And the eldest of this generation of, the one that isn't a bunch of old men, at this point is Louis Napoleon of Holland. Louis Napoleon gets this idea now that maybe he can actually restore the Empire of France and become the new emperor. It sounds silly, and it sounded ridiculous to his family members. His parents and his uncles chastised him for this. They did not want him involved in the Carbonari, in revolutionary activity, because remember, they're trying to look like respectable citizens. They want the king to let them back into France, and they won't. And, part of the reason why the king might not want them back in France is because look at what the heir is doing. The de facto heir, I should say. But Louis Napoleon is not dissuaded by his family members bitching at him. And in fact, he just goes full on into this idea of the restoration of the empire, and he attempts it in 1836. This attempt, of course, fails, resulting in his arrest, and in a letter that he writes to his mother in jail, he says, "What care I for the cries of the common crowd who would call me mad because I have failed, and who would have exaggerated my merits if I had succeeded?" He kind of makes a good point. What care I for the cries of the common crowd? It sounds a little bit elitist, but let this not mislead you. You might think he would be discouraged. If he wasn't discouraged by his family members, you might think this would have discouraged him, getting thrown in jail for a while and then exiled. No, he tries again in 1840. And again, he fails. This time he's put in prison for treason. But we got to understand that the failure of Louis Napoleon is kind of also a symptom of the failure of Louis Philippe. Louis Philippe was quickly becoming an unpopular king. And in a time for France when concerns of the social question were becoming more and more important to French politics, Louis Philippe was not a socialist by any stretch of the imagination. He would not expand the franchise, and his prime minister, François Guizot, agreed with him on this. And when the question of expanding the franchise was proposed to François Guizot, he had this dismissive reply: "Get rich." But that was liberalism. That was the Spanish and now French liberalism. If you don't like your lot in life, then don't stand around demanding more rights. Just, take advantage of the open markets and improve yourself. Improve your own condition. Liberalism was the philosophy of reality. It looked at where power really was coming from. And it wasn't the church, it wasn't the poor, it wasn't the traditional landed nobility. It was money. Money ruled the world, realistically. Liberals thought that this kind of plutocracy was just the most realistic and stable way to build a society. And just a fair one, Like, you don't have to give people things, you just open things up enough that people can make their own way. Giuseppe Mazzini did not like François Guizot. I mean, obviously he didn't. He was very much in favor of universal manhood suffrage, and here is Guizot saying that he disagrees with it. In an essay that Mazzini wrote called In Defense of Democracy, a reply to Mr. Guizot, he said, "The middle-class aristocracy, which has replaced the aristocracy of blood, could not have a more able supporter and a more faithful representative than Mr. Guizot. Humanity's goal cannot be the overthrow of the aristocracy of nobility, or of any particular man who may encroach on the rights of the mass. Rather, its goal lies in the overthrow of aristocracy as such, by whatever term of privilege and exclusiveness it may be called, whether it presents itself as a single man, or as a caste, or as a king, or as a tribune, as an individual, or as an assembly. By claiming that democracy should not oppose the aristocracy of the middle classes, while you are lauding its conflict with the higher classes, you are renouncing every rational basis for the appreciation of events, and you are mistaking for general law the caprices of your own individual impressions." Louis Napoleon was watching all of this conflict, and he saw where the discontent was, and he tried to offer the restoration of the empire as a legitimate answer to the social question, emphasizing the empire's connection to the masses, Napoleon I's use of plebiscites, and marketing Bonapartism as populist. In his pamphlet, Napoleonian Ideas, he wrote, "The Napoleonic idea is not an idea of war, but a social idea, an industrial, commercial, humanitarian idea. If to some men it always seems to be surrounded by the thunder of combat, this was indeed because it was enveloped too long in the smoke of cannon and the dust of battle. But today, the clouds have vanished, and one can see beyond the glory of arms a civil glory, which was greater and more lasting. Louis Napoleon wants to distance the idea of empire from the idea of war and military conquest. And it kind of makes sense because Louis Napoleon, despite being, trained in artillery the way his uncle was, he's not really a soldier the way his uncle was. He did not have the same love of the battlefield, and this will actually have some important consequences in the future. In 1844, while still in prison, Louis Napoleon published another pamphlet called The Extinction of Pauperism, which became a bestseller and really got his name out there. In it, he takes some influence from the democratic socialist Louis Blanc. He said, "Today, the reign of individual classes is finished. One can only govern with the support of the masses." And with that, he argued in favor of universal male suffrage, which was something that the king and Prime Minister Guizot were not going to give. But while Louis Napoleon was making efforts to restore the empire in France, young Italy was making inroads in an interesting location, South America. In the 1830s and 1840s, that's where you start to get these Italian immigrant communities coming into South American cities like Montevideo and Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro. And these cities then become refuge for a lot of revolutionary dissidents from Italy, such as Giovanni Battista Cuneo or Luigi Rossetti, who were friends of Giuseppe Mazzini. They went there after the failure of some of young Italy's operations in the Kingdom of Sardinia. One man who went with them was a 28-year-old merchant sailor named Giuseppe Garibaldi, who probably through connection with Giovanni Cuneo became a Mazzinian and a supporter of young Italy. He was also a big fan of the writings of Henri de Saint-Simon. He had even gotten to meet Giuseppe Mazzini in 1834, I think, before moving to South America, which was immortalized in this painting. And what's interesting about this is that, the French and Italian revolutionary cultures are very intimately linked with each other. Whenever there's revolutionary activity happening in France, it also happens in Italy. But we start to see at the same time a connection forming between Italy and South America. And what's interesting is that this actually continues on, even into the National Socialist epoch properly. In the 1830s and 1840s, there happened to be a civil war happening at the time in Uruguay. And it was a civil war basically between liberals and conservatives. And the conservatives were called blancos or whites. And Argentina actually intervened in the Civil War on the side of the whites. So it went from being a Uruguayan civil war to being a war between Uruguay and Argentina. When Giuseppe Garibaldi gets to Uruguay, he starts fighting in this war on the side of Uruguay, and he gets a lot of attention. Cuneo starts writing to Giuseppe Mazzini from across the ocean about all of the achievements of Garibaldi in Uruguay, and Mazzini is very impressed. In 1843, Giuseppe Mazzini writes back to Cuneo, "Garibaldi is a man who will be of use to the country when it is time for action." From this point forward, Giuseppe Mazzini really starts promoting the name and the face of Giuseppe Garibaldi in his newspaper as this is the representative of the union of thought and action that I want for young Italy. Garibaldi and his team of red shirt Italian volunteers fighting in a foreign country for the liberation of a foreign people is very inspiring to Mazzini, who again thinks that this kind of universal internationalism is very important for the nationalist movement. And they even get involved in a little bit of piracy, so they're kind of like a pirate band of revolutionary patriots. And you know how the cowboy kind of becomes this symbol, the American cowboy becomes a symbol of masculinity and independence in the 20th century in America. Well, at the time, the gaucho was kind of the South American cowboy. The gaucho was a symbol of a similar bent, and Garibaldi really takes to it. He becomes really infused in this sort of gaucho world, and he starts dressing like a cowboy. It gives him this kind of exotic flair when he comes back to Italy. He's exoticized. He's a pirate, adventurer, revolutionary. I mean, he's the whole package. Garibaldi's knowledge of French socialism and South South American politics were as central to his political formation as were his encounters with the Mazzinians. His defiantly exotic and sensual physical appearance could hardly have differed more from the austere image carefully cultivated by Mazzini for himself while in London. In this respect, Garibaldi's persona and the strong responses to it point to his cultivation of a different, more physical political aesthetic, which was to have a broad international appeal. Garibaldi's body, as much as his brain, is important to Garibaldi's image. We have the union of the physical and the ideal, the union of thought and action. As part of this war, both Uruguay and Argentina were both making pleas to Great Britain and France to intervene in the war on their side. Eventually, both Great Britain and France did a joint operation in support of Uruguay. However, I don't think this really increased Louis Philippe's popularity in his home country. His reign was dotted with various assassination attempts, and as he got older, he just kept getting more and more stubborn. There was more and more pressure for him to keep liberalizing the country, but he just refused and held his firm grip as much as possible. And then in the 40s, there was this whole thing with the potato crop failing all over Europe, and that was a disaster, and it was like really bad for food prices. There was a big crisis there. The French government had to import a lot of food, and in the process, they spent way too much money, which really got the liberals mad. So now Louis Philippe is even starting to lose his liberal base of support, which is the only base of support he had. It's not looking good for King Louis Philippe. And it was in the middle of all of this, in 1847, on November 2nd, that something completely unimportant happened. In Cherbourg, Normandy, a child was born to a wine cellar and the daughter of an old Napoleonic officer. This child was given the name Georges Sorel. No, he didn't actually look like that. That's just I don't have any pictures of him as a baby, so I'm just using this picture of Charles Manson because I thought it was funny. Now, this is not one of the most important babies in history, but it is one of my favorites. And he's pretty much going to be the main character of this series going forward for quite some time. So I thought I'd introduce him here when he was born. And he was alive for some of the most tumultuous events of his country's history. And in fact, the year after his birth, 1848, would go down in history as the single biggest year of worldwide revolutionary activity. 1848 will be a major subject in episode 2 of this series, where we'll go over the next 10 years of French and Italian history, discuss a little bit about what happens to the characters, what happens to Louis Philippe, Louis Napoleon, Giuseppe Mazzini, Giuseppe Garibaldi, and maybe a few other characters we'll introduce. A lot of very interesting events will happen during this next 10 years, events which will go on to be very important to Georges Sorel and to the movement that he would go on to inspire. So I hope you enjoyed part 1 of this series, chapter 1. Chapter 2 is coming soon. I have both chapter 2 and chapter 3 written already, so I just need to get them out. So, au revoir and arrivederci.